What's going on, everybody? I've kind of been enjoying this recent series of videos that I've been putting out discussing the state of Magic the Gathering, and I've just been playing a lot of it recently, so I just want to make another one and continue this series that I've been putting out lately. So for this video, I'm actually going to discuss the state of standard now that the bans have gone through and there's been a few days for the meta to kind of shift. The ban happened 5 days ago. It's currently July 4th and it happened on June 30th. So happy 4th of July to anybody who is in the US. But there definitely has been a pretty big shift in the meta in standard right now. The decks, the pace is a lot slower because the aggro decks got nerfed down. So there's a lot more mid-range decks, there's a lot more control decks, and there's a lot more combo decks and stuff like that. So what I wanted to discuss now that it's been a few days and things have been developing is that so many decks are using the graveyard. And that's actually something that I said at the end of my last videos when I was discussing the 7 cards that got banned. I said that we are going to need to be mindful of the graveyard and keep playing some graveyard hate, because now that the aggro decks were nerfed down, I felt like the other decks that were using the graveyard could become a lot more viable. And I was correct. There are so many decks now that are using the graveyard. It's not always the top tier decks that are using the graveyard, because like I think the best performing deck right now is mono white tokens, possibly. Well, it also might be Demir with Kaido, right? Like Demir mid range, and those don't really use the graveyard. But my point is that there are really high tier decks that are using the graveyard, and moreover, it's just so many. It's so prevalent. I've just been playing a lot of standard the past few days, and I play a lot of best of 3 because I tend to prefer that. And man, it is just, I'm constantly sideboarding in my graveyard hate cards. It is just, it seriously feels like 60% of the time, if not more, that I have to sideboard in my graveyard hate. So I'm going to kind of go through and talk about a lot of decks individually, to kind of show you how prevalent this is in case you haven't been playing very much. And then I also just want to kind of go over how each deck is working and what this means for the state of standard as a whole. So the first deck is, it's still here, everybody. This is Azorius Omniscience, and believe it or not, there's actually another deck. There's another deck that is also running Omniscience, and I'm going to get to that one in a second, but I'm going to talk about the Azorius version first. In my first video, not the one where it was necessarily post-bans, but when I was talking about the pre-bans, I said that Omniscience should be banned. And a lot of other people thought that Omniscience should be banned because this card is just too powerful for standard. It really is. And the fact that it's in Foundations and it's not going to rotate out for 4 years, that is just crazy, you know? And even though Abuelo's Awakening is gone, these decks are currently running Repair and Recharge. Now, Repair and Recharge is going to rotate out in the next set. But I said that, you know, these decks were going to run Repair and Recharge instead of Abuelo's Awakening. And look, they can usually wait one more turn. It's not such a big deal. But that being said, you might also be able to kill them by turn 5. You know, having that extra turn does kind of make it, it's also not like an instant or anything like that, right? So having that turn does kind of weaken this deck, but it is very much still here. I don't believe that this Azorius Omniscience deck is like overpowered or necessarily needs to be nerfed down. I'm just looking at the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is that Omniscience is still in standard, and I think that's a mistake because it's going to be legal in Foundations for the next 4 years. And what are they going to do? They're just never going to print a white enchantment reanimation ever again. That's just stupid. For the next 4 years, you know, having Omniscience still available in standard, just, it's so delicate and it's so fragile now because it's so easy for them to just print something that then makes this deck come roaring back with a vengeance, right? So why would you leave this card in and limit what you can end up printing, right? Why would you have to even think about, oh wait, we can't print a white 4 mana enchantment reanimation because Omniscience is still available. Why would you limit yourself like that when you could just ban the card? Like, just ban the card and then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to like be constantly... I'm already so sick of talking about this card, of seeing this card, and we're just going to keep talking about it and keep seeing it for the next 4 years. And so is Wizards. Wizards is going to have to keep talking about it and keep working around it and blah, blah, blah. Why would this card just has a gravitational pull? It is a black hole in the center of a galaxy, and everything is just being pulled around it. And it's just, if we're not careful, the whole universe gets out of balance, right? That's what this feels like. Obviously, we know how this works. You know, they play Omniscience, play Invasion, play Jeskai Resolution, win the game, right? These decks are also running Scroll Shift so that they can cycle the Overlord of the Flood Pits, right? And then, of course, Meringue, and some of them even run Jace as like another win condition, right? Oh, and you're going to have to excuse me when I'm making this video because I don't have all the cards in the decks that I'm going to be discussing. So there's definitely going to be some missing here. So you'll just have to excuse me. You know, I don't have a full collection of all the cards that I'm going to be discussing. But that was only the first deck that was using Omniscience. There is another one. So the other one is a Demir deck, and believe it or not, this one can cheat Omniscience onto the field by turn 4. So it can still happen. These decks seem to run the artifacts just to kind of cycle through the deck a little bit, but also look, they allow you to discard a card, right? So you can discard Omniscience just off of the artifacts. And then the way that the Omniscience gets onto the field is reenact the crime. So you discard Omniscience using one of the artifacts, and then you can play reenact the crime to bring it back because you have discarded it that turn. There's also the reason why this is being run in Demir though, because what happens if you don't have reenact the crime, right? Well, they can run Beseech the Mirror, and Beseech the Mirror allows you to search your library for a card, exile it, and then you can cast that spell without paying its mana cost if it's 4 or less. Well, guess what? Reenact the crime is 4 or less. So if you don't have reenact the crime in your hand, but you do have Omniscience and you have Beseech the Mirror, well, Beseech the Mirror, you get your reenact the crime into off of the effect on the stack, but then before that resolves, you discard Omniscience and then you reenact the crime Omniscience. So that's how you do it. So there's also the Talisman. Look at this. Remove a wish counter from this artifact and search your library for a card. Put it into your hand. I mean, and you don't even have to reveal it. You don't even have to reveal it. Look, remove a wish counter from this artifact, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. You don't even, I mean, the opponent gets control of the artifact, right? You don't have to reveal what card it is. So your opponent doesn't know what you're doing. It's just, the fact that it can come down again on turn 4, and this deck seems to be pretty reliable, honestly, because, you either have to kill this opponent in turn 4, which then they can just do all this stuff, right? You can do this on turn 5 and then just win it. Because you can get this, you can get this, you can get this, whatever. So the bigger picture is that Wizard made a they made a mistake not banning Omniscience. That's just what I think. Now this deck is not necessarily a top tier deck yet, but I think that's because not that many people are playing it, because not that many people know about it. I think that once this deck gets a little bit more traction, more people are going to be playing with it. And unfortunately, look, I'm part of the problem because I'm talking about it, right? But if it doesn't get talked about, then nothing's going to be done about it. So point is, Wizards made a big mistake printing Omniscience in Foundations, and then they made a bigger mistake not banning it, in my opinion. So the next deck I'm going to discuss, this is now the third deck, is the Oculus deck. We know how this one works because it's been in the standard meta for quite a while now, but obviously you use cards like Fear of Missing Out, Terza, Light Shatter, and Steamcore Scholar to put Oculus into the graveyard. The thing is, these decks have also been running Joshua, and Joshua is another way that you can put the Oculus into the graveyard. And then Joshua is actually a pretty good card by itself, because then you can transform it and then you have this Phoenix, right, that does all this other stuff. So obviously the Mako is in these decks because the Mako gets bigger as all these get discarded. And then you reanimate the Oculus using Helping Hand or Recommission, right? We know how this works. But the thing is, these decks can also reanimate Joshua if Joshua goes into the graveyard, because Joshua is also a 3-mana creature. So I actually think that this deck has gotten a little bit stronger with the release of Final Fantasy, and it has definitely gotten stronger with the bans that came out recently, because pretty much none of the cards in this deck got hit with the bans. So they got a tool that literally strengthens the deck, and then they also didn't get any weaker with the bans. We know how this deck works. I'm just saying that this deck appears to be even stronger than it was, right? Because of the bans and because of the addition of Joshua. The next deck I'm going to discuss, this is now the 4th deck, is one that I actually think is very interesting. So this is one that Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, my personal favorite Magic player of all time, brought to the recent Pro Tour. And I don't think it's so surprising that that match that he played on the official Play MTG YouTube channel was one of the highest viewed matches from the whole tournament, because it's Paulo. He is a legend, right? And I also think that people were just very interested in the deck because it was a very different brew from what people were playing at that Pro Tour, because it was before the recent bans, right? So that video got a lot of attention, and this is basically the deck that he played. And now a lot of other people are playing it. So kudos to him for being the, mastermind that he normally is. But it's another deck that uses the graveyard. So if you're not familiar with this deck, then the way that it works, you got the usual suspects here, the Mako, Fear of Missing Out. Then you got a couple other ways of discarding. So Winter Night Stories and Tersa Light Shatter. Then you use Prof's Edict Memory to buff your creatures because you've been drawing cards, right? But then since you're discarding cards, they're going in the graveyard, and the thing that you are utilizing then is Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So you exile the card, but then you put a +1/+1 counter on another creature that you have, and then that creature gets all activated abilities of the creatures that have been exiled with the cauldron. So guess what? If you exile Vivi from your graveyard, then your Fear of Missing Out now has Vivi's ability. And Fear of Missing Out already has 2 power, but then it's going to get 3 power because of the Cauldron +1/+1. And if you're using counters from the Edict, or I guess it's Eidetic, right? That's how you pronounce Eidetic Memory. This thing can have like 5 power or something like that. And then without having to do anything, you have 5 extra mana. Like, it's just crazy. Or you could have Vivi on the field as well, and then your Vivi's getting bigger, right? And then you're also pinging your opponent for 1. But then if you have Vivi on the field and a Vivi in the graveyard, then you have 2 Vivis, because you put a +1/+1 counter on your Fear of Missing Out or your Mako or whatever. So now that creature has Vivi's ability, and then you also have Vivi on the field, which has Vivi's ability. It's insane. You can have like 8 mana just from Vivi's ability, and then also have your 3 or 4 lands. You can have 12 mana in a turn. It's nuts. But then that's not really the win condition. So the win condition is typically the Thrill Seeker, because tap 1, activated ability, right? Sacrifice this creature, it deals damage to its power equal to its power to any target. If your creatures are just getting buffed, whatever creature it is, it doesn't really matter, 8 power, 9 power, 10 power, whatever, then you can just sack it and hit, lava axe your opponent's face, right, for however much damage it is. And you can also do it, look, if you have multiple creatures with this ability, then you can just do it more than once, right? So this deck is very strong. This has kind of been the replacement for the Is It Prowess decks that used Corey Steel Cutter before. Although there is a version of the Is It Prowess decks that just uses that, I forget what that equipment is, but it's new Final Fantasy equipment that puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature whenever you cast a non-creature spell. So that's essentially replaced the Corey Steel Cutter, and otherwise the deck is basically the same. And that deck still does perform pretty well. You're not making like multiple prowess tokens that all have haste, but you're pumping up your creature every single turn with a +1/+1 counter, another +1/+1 counter, right? So anyway, basically the Is It shell is still a pretty good shell in standard, and this is the one that uses the graveyard. The other one uses the prowess. This one doesn't really use prowess at all. Point is, yet another deck that uses the graveyard, right, in the form of the Agatha's Soul Cauldron. The next deck I'm going to discuss is probably one that you were expecting, which is Insidious Roots. Again, you'll have to excuse me. Like I said before, I don't have copies of all the cards on Arena for all the decks that I'm going to be discussing. So this deck is really good. So, you know, we know how this deck works, right? You got all these cards, you're milling into your graveyard, and then you got all these ways of exiling cards from your graveyard, right? So you got the Molt Tender, you got the Overlord of the Baelmerk, you got the Soul Cauldron. There's other ways of like getting the cards out of your graveyard as well. You know, you got Dredger's Insight to get things out of the graveyard, but the point is every time a card leaves your graveyard, you make a plant token, and then you put a +1/+1 counter on the plants. And then if you have Tyvar on the field, then all those creatures have haste. All those plants have haste. You can tap them for mana. You can attack with them, whether they're 6s, 7/7s, 8/8s, whatever they are. And this deck is really challenging to play against, actually, because if you start to remove cards from your opponent's graveyard, because, hey, one way to counter the graveyard hate, right, is to start pulling cards away from the graveyard, right? Well, if you do that, if you pull cards from the graveyard, guess what? That triggers Insidious Roots. So if you're pulling cards out of your opponent's graveyard or making the exiling cards from your opponent's graveyard, you're going to trigger Insidious Roots, and your opponent's just going to get more plant tokens. So this deck is really strong. So you can't really do anything. You kind of just have to hope that your opponent doesn't have the right pieces to just pop off, and you really do need an answer for Insidious Roots. You gotta exile this thing, or get rid of it, or destroy it, or counter it when your opponent plays it, whatever. Because once this thing is on the field, man, your opponent's just gonna start popping off. It happens quick. It happens really fast. By turn 4, your opponent has a huge army of plants, and they get all of haste, and they're just hitting you. Like, it gets kind of scary, honestly. It's a little bit intimidating. And not only that, you know, a lot of these decks run 4 copies of Haywire Might. So one of the best ways to counter graveyards is with one of the artifacts that exiles cards from the graveyard, right? Either Ghost Vacuum or Soul Guided Lantern, or even Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Well, with this thing, you can just blow it up. So you can just blow up those artifacts. This deck is really strong, right? It's really strong. Look, even if you exile the graveyard, it just triggers Insidious Roots. All right, so this deck is just very strong. This deck is very hard, very tough to play against, and this is now the 5th deck, right, that uses the graveyard that I've been talking about. The next deck that I want to discuss, this is now the 6th deck along our graveyard usage standard decks that I've been discussing here, is one that's been gaining a lot of traction, which is the Grul Delirium. It's a pretty self-explanatory deck. It uses a lot of cards from the Duskmourn set that have kind of been revitalized in a sense because of the recent standard bans, right? And, you know, you just get 4 card types in your graveyard, not too hard to do with this type of deck, and then you can start popping off with these different abilities, right? One thing is that the primary creatures in this deck are the Patchwork Beastie and then the Wildfire Wicker Folk, and these are both artifact creatures. So guess what removal spell doesn't work against them? Go for the throat. So that is actually pretty tough to deal with. The best removal spell against this is Anoint with Affliction, but obviously Anoint with Affliction is rotating out, right? So is Go for the Throat, but there's so much black removal that is rotating out in the next set. So I hope that the next set has some removal for black, because, oh man, black is losing so much removal spells. Sealdrift's Edict, right? Cut down, so much stuff. But anyway, this deck is pretty self-explanatory. You know, use Fear of Missing Out to fill the graveyard. There's other ways of filling the graveyard too, just with the Beastie, and then this also typically does run like Dredger's Insight to put another card in the graveyard, right? But it doesn't run black, so it's no access to the Baelmerk and stuff like that. This deck can win pretty comfortably using like breakout, getting a creature onto the field that has haste, and then if you have delirium, then you just boom, right? You hit your opponent for a bunch. It gets +1/+1 or +1/+0, and then also double strike. So these decks have also been running Terra, and this deck, this creature allows you to mill more cards, but then you also put a card into your hand, and then it can potentially get transformed, and then you return your fear of missing out or whatever, and then it gets haste. Because fear of missing out and the other creatures, they're not only creatures, they're also either enchantments or artifacts, right? It's pretty reliable for this deck to get the delirium, and then they typically run 4 copies of Screaming Nemesis, or at least 3 copies of Screaming Nemesis, just to get in for the haste, right? If they target Screaming Nemesis with a burn spell like Torch the Tower or whatever, Burst Lightning, and then you can't gain life for the rest of the game, right? I talked a lot about Screaming Nemesis in my last few videos, and I also just feel like this card has got too much going on, but I don't think this is the video for me to get into that. I made a lot of points in my previous videos about Screaming Nemesis that I think this card just has way too much going on for only 3 mana. But that's how this deck works. You get the delirium, and then you just start popping off with these different abilities, and the creatures can be kind of hard to remove if they're artifacts, right, and stuff like that. I have found though that this deck is not too bad to go up against, because you can just start picking out cards from their graveyard, and then if they don't have delirium triggered, obviously Fear of Missing Out also has like the win condition with delirium, right? And if they have Screaming Nemesis on the field, then they attack with it twice, right? They can attack with it twice, and then if you block it, you take damage to the face, or you can't gain life for the rest of the game, right? That's typically what they do. They'll attack with Fear of Missing Out and Screaming Nemesis, and then Screaming Nemesis attacks twice. The point is that I don't think that this deck is necessarily that strong and that difficult to deal with, because you can pick out the cards to kind of prevent your opponent from having delirium. But again, just another deck that uses the graveyard, right? The next deck that I want to discuss, this is now the 7th deck, is a new one. And actually, this is not only the 7th deck, this is actually the 7th and 8th deck, because there's actually 2 versions to this deck that I'm going to discuss. And it is one that I knew was going to come around, which is the Unibase deck. And I said in my last video that I thought the Una decks were going to become a lot more popular. They definitely have. I've been playing against this deck a ton. I just keep playing against people, more and more people that are just playing the Una decks. So, and I was also a little bit concerned about how strong this deck could potentially be, but I'm going to talk more about that in a second. The way that this deck works is turn 5, Una comes down, and now during that turn, she has Ward 2, and then you can just reanimate any of these crazy enchantments. So you got Bahamut, you got Knights of the Round, and then you got all the usual overlords, right? Mistmores, Hauntwoods, etc., right? And obviously, if Bahamut comes down on the field, you might be dead, right? Or if Knights of the Round comes on the field, you might be dead. So that's the way that this deck works. And also, again, on the opponent's turn, I guess on your turn, if you're playing this, right? Una and the enchantment creatures have Ward 2, right? So they're harder to remove. And then they also have Trample and Lifelink, so you can't really block them. And then if you're behind in life, you get tons and tons of life back, right? So that's the way that this deck works. Now, they do come back with a finality counter. So if you play Go for the Throat on Bahamut, then Bahamut is gone forever, because Bahamut gets exiled, right? So there is that. That is like one weakness in the deck. There are a few ways of making this work. So the green allows you to play Dredger's Insight, but also these decks pretty much run 4 copies of Esper Origins. And I said that Esper Origins, in my last video, I said Esper Origins was going to be played a lot more, and I was definitely correct. It's not only the unit decks that are playing Esper Origins. There are other decks as well that are replacing this card, using it to replace like Up the Beanstalk or other similar things. There are 2 versions to this deck. There is an Abzan version, which uses cards like Virtue of Persistence, Primal Odin, another win condition, right? And an Overlord of the Baelmerk. But then there is also a Naya version that uses Overlord of the Boiler Bridges, Joshua, Terra, and then Fear of Missing Out. Now, These three things are mostly ways of discarding. You know, all of these allow you to discard, right? Or this one allows you to mill, but Fear of Missing Out and Joshua allow you to discard, right? And then Overload of the Boiler Bridges is just a way to do damage, right? It's just a big baddie, right? Big baddie enchantment creature as opposed to the other overlords. So either way that which version your opponent is playing or that you're playing, it runs basically the same way, right? Just get Una on the field and start popping off with your big bad enchantment creatures. Now the thing is that I do feel like this deck is kind of vulnerable. I haven't really lost to this deck very much when I've been playing against it. I've been able to usually come away with the victory. So I don't think it's quite as strong as I was initially feeling. So I really should retract my last statement that I thought that this deck was too strong and would just run wild, because that hasn't really been the case. There's a few reasons why this deck is not super strong and super reliable. One is that, again, the wards only happen on your turn and you don't get haste or anything. So you bring back your Bahamut, that's great, but then your opponent can just kill it on the next turn. And then it's gone forever because it gets exiled because it had a finality counter on it, right? And then your opponent can also remove Una because she doesn't have Ward either. So to that end, it's not really like you play Una and the game is definitely won. You do still have some work to do. Not only that, it's a very predictable deck. It is extremely predictable. Either version that is being played is just extremely predictable. It's so easy to figure out what your opponent's going to play on what turn and what's going to happen and when Una's going to come down or when they have a Una, when they don't. It's just very, very easy. This deck is very, very vulnerable to the graveyard hate. It's not like the Roots deck where if you take things from the graveyard, the Roots deck can still excel, right? This is like extremely vulnerable to the graveyard hate because you can just keep pulling the best enchantment creatures from your opponent's graveyard, right? Or just exile the entire graveyard and then your opponent can't do anything. So to that end, I don't really think there are other ways to win. So you can just play this stuff. Like if you have the mana, you can just play Bahamut, or you can just play Odin, or you can play Virtue of Persistence, right? You know, in general, I don't think that this deck was quite as strong as I was initially fearing. But the point is, just two more decks that are using the graveyard, right? Decks 7 and 8. Deck number 9 is the one that certainly I've kind of been saving here because it's a really obvious one, and that is the Ratosse Reanimate deck. You know, look, Ratosse historically has been the color combination for reanimation, right? So it's no surprise that there's kind of like a Ratosse Reanimate deck right now. You know, seems like every, you know, couple of standard cycles we have a Ratosse Reanimate deck that you can play. But this one is very powerful. This one is very, very strong. I said in my first video where I was kind of speculating what cards should be banned, I said that Zombify should be banned. And I know that I was reaching a little bit with that. I know that a lot of people aren't going to agree, but the reason why I think that is because it's only 4 mana. So for 4 mana, you can get any creature from your graveyard back onto the battlefield. No restrictions, nothing. You can even just splash this in another deck because that's only 1 black. So for 1 black and 3 colorless mana, you can just bring back any creature from your graveyard. No restrictions. To me, that's a little too much. You know, it feels like, again, similar to when Omniscience was routinely being put down on turn 4, being able to put down some really powerful mega creature on turn 4, it just seems like too much for me. You know, that seems like it's too ahead of the pace of how the game should be played. You know, reanimating on turn 5, you know, that's kind of been a common thing, right? But guess what? This isn't the only way to reanimate on turn 4. There's also Volgavoss Faithful, right? Now, obviously, if you see this creature, you'd probably just remove it immediately. You can anoint with Affliction it or whatever, but you can also play this on turn. There's a lot of ways to reanimate on turn 5. There's this one. There's Rakdos Joins Up. There's Cruelty of Gix, Evil Reawakened, Defossilize, right? There's all these ways of reanimating on turn 5 aside from Zombify, which is turn 4. And look, we know how this deck works, right? You put your creatures in the graveyard and then you pull something mega from the graveyard and start popping off. But the fact that Arden is now in standard, oh man, this guy is nuts. This guy is absolutely nuts. This guy is so powerful. This guy is so strong. You pull all these cards, they all have haste and they all have menace and lifelink and stuff, and they have all these crazy effects. It's just, this deck is really crazy. And not only that, you got push and pull. Push and pull, you can pull 2 cards from a single graveyard and then they have haste, right? So you can pull any 2 cards and then they just, you know, start popping off again. So this is just another really, really powerful deck. Now, the thing is that because you actually have to play these cards and none of them are instants, you know, they're all like either sorcery or enchantments, you can respond, right? You can respond by pulling the card that they were going to play from the graveyard so that they can't do it. You can respond by countering the spell. So there are ways of kind of getting around this, right? You can also exile, you know, Arden if he comes on the field, or exile one of these other things. Now, you can't really exile Volgavoth because Volgavoth, you got to sacrifice 3 non-land permanents to target him, right? But, you know, you can like Sunfall and stuff like that. Now, some of these cards are rotating out. Sunfall is also rotating out, right? But Cruelty of Gix is going away, Atali's going away, Atraxis is going away. But still, this, look, so that's only 2 of the most powerful creatures gone from this deck. And then you got the rest of the stuff. So you could just run like multiple copies of these things or something in place of running, you know, 1 of each or whatever. So this deck is just still going to be very relevant and very strong. And I know I was reaching a bit for Zombify to be banned, but I just think for 4 mana, having one of these really powerful creatures on the field by turn 4, especially if you reanimate Arden on turn 4 and then you get a second thing, right? If your opponent can't respond to Arden right away, if at instant speed, then at the start of combat, you got another thing. It's just like, bro, you know, you need an immediate response to this. So anyway, just another deck, right, that uses the graveyard. And there's actually, so the 10th deck that I'm going to talk about is another deck that uses similar reanimation spells. So the other deck that I was going to discuss is the Dinosaurs. So Dinosaurs is kind of another one that's doing much the similar thing, right? You got the same reanimation spells for the most part. Well, I guess you could include those other ones too. I just included like a random 3. Well, they typically do play Rakdos joined up and they do play Zombify, but they might not play Cruelty of Gix. They might just play something else or not even bother with it at all. But, you know, you got the Invasion, you got Seize the Spoils to discard these big dinos into the graveyard. You can also just discard Carnosaur to do 3 damage or something, and now it's in the graveyard, and then you get these mega creatures on here. And these decks will typically run more than 1 copy of Rakdos joined up because with like the treasure tokens from either of these things, you can cast it on turn 4, right? And then get one of these big things back. So if you can get something back, you might as well get it with 2+1/+1 counters on it, right? And then not only that, whenever a legendary creature you control dies, it deals damage equal to that creature's power, right? So you got all these legendaries. It's just yet another deck using the same reanimation spells as the previous one. So that was 10 decks that are being played pretty consistently. In my opinion, that it's the primary mechanic for how the deck actually works. But the thing is, there are many other decks in Standard that while they might not use the graveyard as the primary thing, they are using the graveyard to some extent. So what I have here is just a few other miscellaneous cards that also utilize the graveyard. So some common suspects here, right? I guess I'll kind of order these in the ones that are played a little bit more often, but you know, you got Storm Chaser's Talent, Chico, Raise the Pass, Alicia, right? You know, these use the graveyard, right? And Chico is a big momentum swing for those Jeskai decks. Storm Chaser's Talent, we know how this thing works, right? Even though it's not really being played as much, but it does use the graveyard, right? Because you get to, when you get it to level 2, Raise the Past, oh my gosh, I have lost to this card many times. Alicia, same thing. Then there's just a few other cards here like Bloodghast, Ren and Realmbreaker. You know, this thing says that you can play lands and cast permanent spells from your graveyard. Then you got this thing, Songcrafter Maids. This one doesn't really get played, but you know, you can harmonize something in your graveyard. And then Aurora Possession as well, right? This I've seen more in like Sultai decks, you know, not really being played as often as some of the other stuff. The point that I'm saying here is that there are decks even in the meta right now, even outside of the primary graveyard culprits that are using the graveyard. These are not the primary graveyard culprits, right? But they do use the graveyard. So, and these are other decks. So now, you know, these are all different decks, right? This is a different deck, this is a different deck, this is a different deck. So now we're talking 14 decks. And the big idea that I'm saying here is that the graveyard is such an important aspect of the standard meta right now. And simply killing things and getting them off the battlefield is not enough, right? You have to be able to exile. You have to be able to work around the graveyard. So to that end, I think it is a good time to talk about the ways to deal with this kind of thing, right? So I'm going to discuss that as well. So these are some of the cards. There's more here than what I've shown, but these are some of the cards that can deal with the graveyard, you know. So you got like the most common things like Soul Guided Lantern, Ghost Vacuum, right? And then for black, Strategic Betrayal. You got Scavenging Ooze, right? But then there's other things too, you know, Dreams of Steel and Oil. It technically can pull a creature from the graveyard, even though this one is rotating out. You got Keen-Eyed Curator, Heritage Reclamation, even Scrap Gorger, although this one is also rotating out, right? But this one can remove something from the graveyard. This one is actually interesting. I actually forgot that this was a card until I saw somebody play it against me. So this is interesting, right? You get to choose a card name, and then you get to search your opponent's graveyard, hand, library for those 4 cards, and then exile them, right? And then shuffles. So one thing that's interesting about this is that unlike other ones like Deadly Cover-Up or even the End, where the player gets to draw a card, right? They draw a card if you're pulling cards from their hand. Whereas this, they don't draw a card if you pull things from their hand. So that is one thing to keep in mind with this thing, the Ancient Vendetta. Kaya also does exile things from the graveyard and stuff. And then there's, of course, Cease and Desist, right? Cease is an instant. So that is one thing. You can exile 2 cards from a graveyard. So the point that I'm saying is that, yes, there are ways of dealing with the graveyard. However, the ways of dealing with the graveyard are primarily restricted to like black and green and a little bit of white with Kaya, right? But if you have a blue and red deck, you can't really work around the graveyard unless you're playing Agatha's Soul Cauldron, or you're playing Ghost Vacuum or Soul Guided Lantern or something like that, right? And the thing that I want to say about this is, as I said at the beginning of this long video, is that I play a lot of best of 3, and I have to constantly sideboard in more graveyard hate, because so many decks are using the graveyard. And to that end, you know, I think that Ghost Vacuum is like a card that every single deck might need in the sideboard. And I want to just take a step back to kind of really think about that. Every single deck in standard right now, every single one, can pretty much benefit from having this one single card in the sideboard. Doesn't that seem a little insane? Doesn't that seem a little bit weird that this one card, Ghost Vacuum, should be in every single sideboard? That to me is a little weird, but honestly, it's true. Every single deck could run 1 or 2 copies of Ghost Vacuum and it would be worth it. But that just seems a little bit strange to me. Like every single deck needs to run this in the sideboard? Well, I would say yes, because there's so many decks that are using the graveyard right now that you can't really justify not having it in your sideboard. There's a bigger picture. It seems a little bit weird that graveyard hate is so prevalent, and it also seems a little bit weird that every single deck in standard right now can benefit from running this one card, Ghost Vacuum. It's a little bit too much, in my opinion. It's a little bit weird that so many decks are using the graveyard. I particularly don't like it. And look, that's just my opinion. Maybe other people do like it, but I personally don't. I don't like how there's kind of like this one aspect of standard that is so prevalent across everywhere. It's like graveyard. If you don't happen to have your Ghost Vacuum or your Strategic Betrayal or whatever the heck anything else is, right? It's like those decks are just going to get to do whatever they want, because removing the creatures and removing the stuff is not enough. That's the point that I'm making here. Simply removal is nerfed, right? Overall general removal is nerfed in this meta right now. You have to exile. And the point that I'm saying here, again, eyes on the big picture. This meta that we are in feels a little, it still feels a little one-dimensional, whereby even though we have many different decks that are strong right now or that are viable, so many of them are using the graveyard. So the graveyard is just an extension of the deck at this point. And look, other people might not think it's a problem. You know, that's fine, but I just personally don't like it. And I also just think it's a little bit weird. I think it's a little bit weird that in the sideboard right now, you pretty much have no reason to not run a Ghost Vacuum regardless of what deck you're playing. I mean, I guess if you're playing a deck that uses Agatha's Soul Cauldron, then you don't have to run Ghost Vacuum because you already have a card that basically does that effect, right? But otherwise, you should be running Ghost Vacuum in your sideboard. And I think it's a little bit strange that every single deck should run a Ghost Vacuum in the sideboard. Maybe that's just the way it is for a little while. We'll see what happens when things rotate out. I personally don't think that when the next set comes out, much is going to change. There's still going to be very prevalent graveyard decks. The Roots deck might not be played anymore because Tyvar is going to rotate out, but still, so many decks are going to use the graveyard, and we're still going to have to run that graveyard hate. So anyway, that's what I wanted to discuss in this video. It just seems a little bit crazy to me. How many? So I listed 10 decks that use the graveyard as a primary mechanic for what they're going to be doing, right? For their shell. And there's others. It's not only those 10 that I mentioned, but then there's even other decks that are using, you know, there's other standard decks that are not primarily using the graveyard, but do have cards that utilize the graveyard. That's the meta right now. I hope you have enjoyed this little analysis here. Actually, very big analysis because this video is absurdly long, right? And again, I personally don't like it, but I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm not saying that it's necessarily worse than the way that it was before. And, you know, look, if other people like this meta, then that's fine. It's just something I wanted to point out. It's just an analysis that I wanted to do of the current state of Standard. Really, the only thing that I wish Wizards had done differently was ban Omniscience. Definitely ban Omniscience. And maybe ban Zombify, right? Maybe ban Zombify. But I know I'm reaching with the Zombify, you know? So anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this analysis video of the current state of Standard. And I will see you in the next video.